Hello, welcome back on this rainy day. So today I wanted to go into more detail on some of the original source material. So in addition to the Rachel's book, which describes some of Rand's arguments and describes some of Hobbes' arguments, I've assigned you actual passages by Rand and some actual passages by Thomas Hobbes. And I'd like you to practice reading this original source material. Rand's not so hard. She's she's a 20th century writer, and not too difficult. She's a fairly clear writer too. She's primarily a writer of fiction, so she knows how to. Hobbes were a few centuries ago, and even harder when they're writing in English. So Hobbes was writing in English, but it's the English of whatever 300 years ago now, and it's almost a different language sometimes. So the Hobbes can be difficult. So we're going to walk through some of the arguments as presented here in these readings. It shouldn't take too long. So first, we're going to talk about Rand's virtue of self. She is an ethical egoist, right? We've talked about ethical egoism a little while back, and we've talked about her arguments. You may notice when you read her actual writings, it's not exactly, I don't know, Rachel's doesn't quite present it in the same way she presents it. So it's worthwhile to look at her words. You may argue that Rachel's misinterprets her, right? And that there's a more, she's actually, you may find that her arguments are more convincing coming out of her own mouth. So she starts by sort of taking issue with the way she sees the study of ethics and of ethical theory presented in her time. Now, I don't know exactly how it was presented in her time, or if she took an ethics course at some point and was disappointed in how it was, but the way she describes it, to me, is not the way we approach ethics these days, right? So when she talks about the study of ethics, she seems to think that we spend a lot of time concentrating on questions like, should you risk your life to save someone who's drowning, or something like that. I've never encountered that in an ethics class. The sort of thought experiments that have encountered in ethics and that get discussed a lot are things like the trolley problem. So some of you may be familiar with the trolley problem, uh, but I'll describe it briefly. So the idea is there's a trolley running down a track, and you happen to be standing near it, and you see, oh no, there's five people tied to the track, right? And if the trolley keeps going, it's going to kill these five people. And then you also realize that you're standing next to a switch, and if you pull the switch, divert the trolley onto a different track and save those five people. Unfortunately, on the other track, there's one person tied there, right? Um, so someone would still die if you pulled the lever, but only one would die instead of five. And we ask, would you pull the lever, right? And most people say yes in that situation. And then you tweak the problem in all kinds of different ways, try to figure out, well, what sort of ethical theory is this person working from? Are they just doing the numbers? Because if you tweak it in slightly different ways, where now you have to push somebody off a bridge to stop the trolley, people will tend to not say, no, I wouldn't do that, right? So it's not just a numbers game. There seems to be something about pulling a lever is okay, but pushing someone is not. What's the difference between the two? And so we try to, pry apart all the factors that are going on in people's heads when they're solving dilemmas using these. Um, that's what we do. That's not exactly what Rand is describing or imagining ethics is about, right? But at any rate, she doesn't like the approach ethics that she's describing. She thinks it makes certain kind of false, and they are as follows. She thinks that the study of ethics, as most people do it, assumes a certain lack of self-esteem. She thinks that a lot of the questions that we deal with are not about how to live your life, but about how to sacrifice it. So, jump into a lake and risk your life to save a drowning person or something like that. Number two, she thinks that the way ethics is studied demonstrates a lack of respect for others, meaning that these sorts of questions and these thought experiments are we're just treating others as sort of helpless objects, right? Save rather than as agents with their own ability to probably save themselves. Number three, thinks the world ethics describes as like a nightmare view of existence. Right? We're always talking about these horrible scenarios where someone's going to hit by a train or is drowning and needs to be saved. And she thinks that that's a sort of a warped view of reality, right? We're not always in that much danger very frequently, right? So why are we always talking about these situations? And then number four, she thinks that this approach engenders a sort of cynical amorality because all these sorts of questions are not the sorts of moral decisions that you would ever actually encounter, and so they're actually avoiding all the important moral problems that you would actually encounter. You're never going to be in a trolley problem situation, but you might have other issues that come up that would be better to focus on. So that's her characterization of, the state of ethical theory. We can sort of question these. I mean, number one, her assumption that this lack of self-esteem, that she's always talking about how you can sacrifice yourself for others. I don't find that to be the case, right? Um, you know, I've never had in an ethics class someone say, "Oh, should you jump in a lake to sacrifice yourself for someone who's drowning?" Um, but I have encountered like trolley problem examples that are low self-esteem. You're not sacrificing yourself, right? So I don't know. I guess I think Peter Singer does talk about something about jumping in a pond. So I don't know. Maybe she's right. This does come up, but it doesn't seem to be that prevalent. Number two, the lack of respect for others. This may be true, right? Definitely, just to take the trolley problem example, all these people tied to the track are sort of just like faceless people that it's up to you to save or whatever. If that's a lack of respect, I don't know, right? Seems like in that situation, the thought experiment is designed that they're tied to the track. But I don't know, maybe she's right. Maybe that's the problem. Um, may also be right about the nightmare view of existence. We do seem to focus a lot on these dramatic life and death sort of thought experiments in ethics. Um, and yeah, they are highly artificial, right? They're not the sort of situation you find yourself in. Um, but I worry that she doesn't quite understand the reasons for doing these sorts of thought experiments. I mean, the idea is not to come up with realistic situations, but to manipulate certain variables. The reason we come up with the trolley problem is we want to know, you know, um, when we're talking about human life, right, does the number matter? Right? Is it five lives worth more than one? Right? And this does come up in real life, like politicians, presidents do have to make these sorts of decisions all the time, right? They make decisions where either way, people are going to die, right? And they have to ask, well, should I save, 1,000 lives by sacrificing one, in wars and things like that? They do this all the time, right? So, I mean, it's not so crazy. And again, the idea is like we're concocting these weird examples because there's very specific variables that we want to manipulate and see people's intuitions change. So I don't know. Maybe some of her critique of how we approach ethics hits the mark. Maybe some of it is a little old-fashioned. I don't know. But on the whole, she thinks that this approach to ethics makes valuing other people and yourself incompatible. Right? She sees this as this sort of dichotomy set up where if you want to care about others, then you have to sacrifice yourself. You have to not value yourself, right? Um, and she doesn't buy this situation, right? That is in fact the situation. She thinks, no, we can have a win-win. I can be selfish and also benefit others. Um, Maybe the most charitable interpretation of what she's trying to say, right, is that instead of focusing so much on our duties to others, um, we should remember that we are humans too, right? And we have moral duties to ourselves, right? And maybe we could focus a little bit more uh, on ourselves and what is the right way to live our own lives. And, other people are just as rational as us, right? Other adults. Maybe it is wrong if we think far, if we put too much stress on our duties or obligations to other people. So, like one of the premises of this class that we're basically assuming is that there's an important connection between morality and rationality. Again, I make a moral judgment and I say you should not have an abortion or you should have an abortion. You have the right to ask me why, and I should have to give you reasons for my moral judgment, right? I can't just and then walk away. Right? It's a rational enterprise. Right? Um, but Rand wants to argue that rationality dictates that we always place a greater value on our own interests. Right? Um, so it seems for her, right, that your own life is a source of all value. I discussed this a bit when I discussed ethical egoism. I'm doing a fair amount of interpretation for her. I think she's saying, look, all I have is my one life, right? I'm brought into the world, I die. Uh, why would I give that up for someone else, right? It's all I have. It's the source of all value for me, right? So I'm going to invest in my own life while I have it. One of the good things about Rand's approach, right? Whether or not you like it, um, all of these theories are going to have problems and all of them are going to have good things about them, right? So you should sort of take note of all of them because in the end, you're going to have to come back to these if you're deciding to choose a theory and you'll be like, none of these are perfect, right? So which one of these seems to have the most upside and the least downside? So the upside to Rand is she can make sense of why we feel that we have greater moral commitments to those that are close to us, right? Our parents, our children, our close friends, our relatives, than to strangers. And the reason for that is our interests are tied up with the interests of those who are close to us, right? Part of your identity, is wrapped up in who you choose as a spouse, right? Or who your child is. And you want them to do well, right? You are happy when they're happy, you are unhappy when they are unhappy. And so, of course, I'm going to care more about my wife or my child than I am about some stranger on the other side of the world. And that does reflect how we actually behave and how we do actually feel. And Rand can make sense of that, right? Because we're egoists. And so we can care about humanity insofar as they are also humans, but the ones that are close to us and with our own interests, of course, we're going to feel more moral commitment. So, look at the drowning person, right? So if the person that's drowning is a stranger and there's great risk to yourself, right, then she would say, no, you should not try to save that person. In fact, that's how we actually behave. That would be how the lifeguard would tell you to do too. Yeah, there's no point in two people drowning, right? So certainly don't swim out and risk your life to save a drowning stranger, right? You're just going to drown people. And if you drown, now all of a sudden, what's going to happen to the people that depend on you, right? That seems like a bad idea. So it seems like Rand kind of gets that one right. Um, but if that person, if the drowning person is your child or your wife, of course you're going to jump in, and um, people would blame you, right? People, if you didn't jump in, right? Because that person is so close to you, in a sense, you have committed treason against yourself and your own values if you don't fight for your another person, like a spouse or a child, right? So she says the virtue in helping people when they are close enough to you, integrity, not selflessness. Right? Your values are tied up with them. Part of your life is tied up with their life, and that's when selflessness or apparent selflessness is required of you. So she doesn't say we owe nothing to total strangers, right? So again, life is a supreme value, and they have lives too. Not assuming that I'm the only being in the universe, right? Um, and insofar as they are human beings, they also have value. Um, and insofar as they are the same sort of beings as you, right? Humans instead of like, snakes, um, they have even more value, right? Um, so there's a certain baseline where, yeah, if someone in front of you is, someone gets hit by a car and they're bleeding, yeah, go over to them, call an ambulance, do what you can to help, right? Um, they are humans, right? I would say uh, you're invested in them, and as you're invested in humanity to a certain degree, right? But she also thinks that their value can decline, right, or be brought down if they fail to respect themselves. So she's not so explicit, but I think you can imagine if someone falls into drug addiction, right, and they get worse and worse off, and all of a sudden they're broke and now they're homeless, and they can't or won't stop, uh, right, shooting up heroin. Um, Rand would say in that case that they have destroyed their own value, right? They've destroyed their own life, and you don't really owe them anything, right? She says, look, if it's an emergency, right? Someone's been hit by a car. I don't know anything about this person. They're lying on the ground bleeding. Yeah, you give them the basic human value and you help them. But if you know someone has failed themselves, then she says they don't deserve your help, right? That was up to them to help themselves out, and they have degraded themselves. So, I mean, some of this may sound fairly familiar as some of the conservative, even in this country. And Rand is, in many ways, sort of a libertarian, as a branch of the right-wing conservative movement here. Um, she thinks that our only duty to society is to create one um, that doesn't keep people from pursuing their own lives and their own interests. So a very minimal sort of state um, that just allows people to pursue their own interests. He doesn't think you should be forced to give up some percentage of your income to the poor through taxation. Um, right? Poverty is an emergency situation, right? It's poverty and it takes a while. Um, and she thinks that the responsibility is on the poor person to improve their own situation, although there may be exceptions there. But in general, the default shouldn't be that everyone has to give up a part of their income to help the less fortunate. Um, and she thinks this is a good thing, right? She thinks her way of thinking is an optimistic view of the universe, where if everyone just tries, right, and actually respects their own value and puts in a little effort, they all succeed as long as we let them succeed. You know, is that true or not? That's kind of an empirical question, but she thinks at least she's being more optimistic than some of the ethical theories that say, no, we need to give up more of ourselves to give to the poor because they live in a universe where they're just screwed. Right? Nobody's totally screwed in this universe, right, if you put in the effort. Okay, so that was Rand, and just getting into a little more detail. Maybe some of you may want to write on Rand, or at least want to understand her a little better. A writer. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit about Hobbes. Now, the Hobbes reading lines up, I think, much more closely with the Rachel's explanation of Hobbes. But there's a little bit more in this Leviathan reading uh, than Rachel's covers that I think help clarify some of the argumentation. So this part is pretty similar to what we've covered in Rachel's, where um, Hobbes starts out with a few basic assumptions about humanity that he thinks all add up to a situation that he calls the state of nature, right? So he starts out with the claim that humans are pretty equally matched when it comes to strength. I mean, sure, there's plenty of people out there that are bigger than me that could beat me up, but if I got together with two, three friends, we could probably take them down, right? Even if it's a pretty big guy. And likewise with intelligence, even really smart people, if you gang up on them, right, you can win. So um, this rough equality among humans leads us all to think we have a pretty good chance of getting the things we want, right? None of us thinks like, oh, I can't even compete. I give up. I'm not even going to like try to survive, right? Um, and it makes it so no one can really become completely dominant and just start bossing everybody around, right? Um, but if we're with a situation where everybody's trying to get what they want and someone else is trying to get the same thing you want and there's not enough to go around, now you have enemies, right? Um, so in that situation, we always have to be prepared to fight for the things we want, right? There's going to be a competition here. So we've got equality and competition for scarce resources, and that ends up that leads to war fighting among people, right? Now, if there were some great power, some superhuman that can sort of keep us all in check, that would be a different situation. But the problem is we don't have that everybody's pretty close. So we end up in the state of war, the state of nature, a war of all against all, right? Everybody's looking out to get their stuff, fighting everybody else for the same stuff. So in that situation, you're not going to have much in terms of culture. Everyone's too busy protecting their own positions and their own life to really build or create anything interesting. Nobody's going to be painting the Mona Lisa right? While they're trying to look over their shoulder and sleep with one eye open to make sure that they can survive. You might be able to build a little hut for yourself, but that's about it, right? You're not going to get big research and development teams or universities or anything like that. Life, as he describes it, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And these are assumptions he's making about humanity, but they're not so crazy, right? If you go around and look at, you know, all the locks on all the doors of all the buildings and the cars, right? There's a reason for those, right? We know that when we're not looking, um, people could come take our stuff, right? And there's a lot of police out there with a lot of guns, right, to keep people from taking each other's stuff and hurting each other, right? In general, there's still a lack of trust among humans, right? And a certain amount of like having to watch out for yourself, right? So he thinks we can only exist at peace by having laws and the threat of punishment if you break those laws. While you're in the state of war, right, this war of all against all, state of nature, at that point, and this is where this is some new information, right, from Hobbes that Rachel's didn't cover, right, and I think it's interesting and relevant. So he says, in this state, there's no such thing as right and wrong. There's no justice. There's no injustice. Morality kind of doesn't exist at this point. You only get morality when we get laws. Um, because human nature is just sort of naturally selfish and violent, you're not going to get morality from human nature, right? You're going to get it from society, right? Also, in the state of war, there's no such thing as property, right? You just get whatever you can hang on to, and then if somebody takes it from you, it's theirs, right? There's no such thing as private property, no such thing as morality. Right? So to get out of the state of the war, we need laws. He calls these the laws of nature. Um, what he means by laws of nature is slightly different than like in science class, right? But he sort of he can stipulate his own terminology if whatever he wants to call it. Like that's his business. So he says we are born with certain rights. There's no morality yet, right? But he says every person has the right to defend their own life and to use whatever means necessary to do so, right? Kill you to defend my life, I have that right. Now, um, we might at some point use reasons. We are rational, right? Decide that you know what, I have the right to kill you to preserve my own life, but I could preserve my own life even better if we both agreed to give up our right, right? Now we've made a deal, and that's an even better way to preserve my life than fighting every person. So what a law is a limitation on your rights. You start out with the right to do anything in the world to agreement. Everybody says, let's give up some rights. That's what a law is. Everybody um, you can renounce your rights. You can give them to someone else if you want, um, but you can't be coerced or forced to give up a right. Rights are it's not like a piece of property that I can steal from you. It's something inherent in you, and you're the only one who can give it up. And you're only going to give it up if you think you're going to get something good in return. Um, if we come to agreement, we're all going to renounce our rights to, say, killing each other, right? Everybody can say, you know what, murder is off limits. We've all agreed, right? We renounce our right to murder each other. And that's going to be a good deal for me. It's going to be a good deal for everybody. Now, if I go back and try to take my right back and try to kill somebody, now I've acted immorally. Now I've acted unjustly, right? This is where morality and immorality enter the stage after an agreement has been made and some rights have been renounced. Right? So before we renounce our rights, immorality doesn't exist. Once we all agree to renounce our rights and we have some laws, now you can do something that's unjust or immoral. So when one or more people agree, right, to mutually transfer a right, we call it a contract. Um, Now, a contract is worth nothing unless it's enforceable, right? Um, if if we both just both say, okay, I agree not to murder you, well, okay, what's to stop you from murdering me in my sleep? Right? So we need some greater power than both of us that can enforce the contract. Right? Now, for Hobbes, this meant everyone transferring their rights to a single king or monarch. That's what Leviathan is in his book, the name of his book, monarch, right? To whom everyone transfers their rights. Um, so Hobbes thinks that the state of nature naturally leads to a monarchy, right? So he's not like a theorist like we are. He's a monarchist, but the basic idea of the social contract comes from him. So then the reading goes into the various laws of nature. He claims there's 19. I honestly have trouble keeping track and counting them right. So you don't need to go through them all. If if you think you want to write on it, it's there for you to look through. I just wanted to get this basic idea of Hobbes on the table. I think it's important, this idea of rights, renouncing rights, and how morality enters. He clarifies it a bit more than Rachel does. So that's it. I think relatively short lecture, right? And yeah, if you have any questions or want to, come office hours,